You're just a burden now. My son whispered it at my husband's funeral, as if he were offering condolences instead of cutting something loose inside me that I didn't even know was still holding on. I remember the exact moment because everything else felt blurred, like a photograph taken through rain-streaked glass. The church smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, and the soft murmur of voices filled the air, but that sentence landed with a clarity so sharp it silenced everything else. I turned my head slowly to look at Daniel, searching his face for some trace of the boy I had raised, the one who used to hold my hand in parking lots and ask if I'd be waiting when he got home from school. But there was nothing there except impatience, and something colder, something practiced. Behind him, Sophie stood with her hands folded neatly, her black dress perfectly tailored, her expression composed in a way that didn't quite match the occasion. When our eyes met, she gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not warm. Not kind. Just, certain. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to see before. This wasn't grief pulling them away from me. This was something else entirely. I smiled back. Not because I was unaffected, but because reacting would have given them something they were clearly expecting. Instead, I turned forward again, focusing on the casket at the front of the room, on Edward's photograph placed beside it, his familiar, gentle smile captured in a frame that suddenly felt too final. 35 years of marriage, reduced to a picture and a room full of people speaking in hushed tones. I sat there through the service without shedding a tear. Not because I didn't feel the loss, but because something deeper had settled in, something quieter and far more solid than grief. It was awareness. The kind that comes when the world shifts just enough for you to finally see the cracks that had been forming all along. After the service ended, people approached me one by one, offering condolences, squeezing my hand, telling me how strong I was. I nodded, thanked them, listened as they spoke about Edward's kindness, his work ethic, his steady presence. I had known all of that already. What I hadn't known was how quickly everything around me would begin to change once he was gone. By the time we returned to the house, the shift had already begun. The same house I had lived in for over 3 decades felt different, not because Edward wasn't there, but because of how the others moved through it. Daniel walked in first, loosening his tie, already on his phone, speaking in low tones about something that sounded suspiciously like logistics. Sophie followed, glancing around the living room with a critical eye, as if seeing it not as a home, but as a space to be evaluated. I stood near the doorway for a moment, watching them, feeling like a guest in a place I had once known by heart. We should probably start thinking about what's next, Sophie said casually, running her fingers along the edge of the mantel. This house is a lot. Daniel nodded without looking at me. Yeah. It's probably too much for Mom to handle on her own. The words were framed as concern, but they landed differently now. I could hear what was underneath them, the same thing that had been whispered in my ear just hours earlier. Burden. The word lingered in the air, even though no one said it again out loud. I moved further into the room, setting my purse down on the table, my movements slow and deliberate. I've managed this house for a long time, I said evenly. Daniel finally looked at me, but only briefly, as if holding my gaze required more effort than he was willing to give. Things are different now, Mom. Sophie stepped in smoothly, her tone soft but firm. We just want what's best for you. Somewhere smaller. Easier. With support. Support. Such a gentle word for something that felt like removal. I nodded once, as if considering it, even though something inside me had already settled into place. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply watched. Over the next 24 hours, that decision, to watch instead of react, showed me more than any confrontation ever could have. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, the house still quiet. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the absence beside me in bed, the space where Edward used to sleep, the faint indentation still visible on his pillow. Then I got up, dressed carefully, and made my way downstairs. By the time Daniel and Sophie came down, coffee in hand, I was already seated at the kitchen table. They spoke in low voices, not realizing I could hear them from where I sat. "We need to move quickly," Sophie said. If we list it soon, we can get a good price. Yeah, Daniel replied. And we should start clearing things out. No point waiting. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest as their words confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about helping me. This was about taking control. Later that morning, while they were busy discussing floor plans and renovation ideas in the living room, I quietly picked up my purse and keys. I'm going out for a bit, I said. Daniel barely looked up. Okay. No questions. No concern. Just indifference. I stepped outside, the crisp air hitting my face as I walked to the car. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Not the kind meant for others. The kind that comes when a plan begins to form. Because while they were measuring rooms and talking about what to remove, there was something they didn't know. Something Edward had made sure of. And I was about to find out exactly what that was. I had not been inside First National Bank alone in over 20 years. Edward always handled everything, always said it was simpler that way, that it gave him peace of mind to take care of the details so I would not have to worry. I used to think that was love expressed through responsibility, and perhaps it was. But as I pushed open the glass door and stepped into the quiet, carpeted lobby, I began to wonder if it had also been something else. Preparation. The kind that only reveals itself when everything else falls apart. The air inside was cool, faintly scented with something clean and impersonal. A young woman at the front desk looked up and offered a polite smile. Good morning, ma'am. How can we help you today? I hesitated for just a second, feeling the weight of unfamiliarity settle over me. Then I straightened my shoulders. I need to review my accounts, I said. My husband handled everything, and he recently passed away. Her expression softened immediately, the professional distance giving way to something more human. I am very sorry for your loss. Let me get someone who can assist you. A few minutes later, I was seated across from a woman named Karen, a branch manager with kind eyes and a voice that carried both warmth and precision. She listened carefully as I explained my situation, nodding in understanding, her fingers already moving across her keyboard. Of course, Mrs. Hale. Let us take a look at everything together. The screen reflected faintly in her glasses as she pulled up my profile. At first, everything seemed ordinary. A checking account. A savings account. Modest balances, enough to manage, but nothing that would explain Edward's quiet confidence over the years. I felt a flicker of disappointment, not because I expected wealth, but because I had hoped for some sign that he had left me more than memories and a house that others were already trying to take from me. Then Karen paused. It was subtle, just a slight stillness in her posture, but I noticed it immediately. Her eyes moved across the screen again, slower this time. That is interesting, she said softly. My hands tightened slightly around the strap of my purse. Is something wrong? She turned the monitor just enough so she could continue looking at it while still facing me. Not wrong, exactly. I just want to make sure I am reading this correctly. There was a brief silence as she clicked through a series of files, her expression shifting from polite professionalism to something closer to surprise. Mrs. Hale, she said carefully, when was the last time you reviewed your full financial portfolio with your husband? I let out a quiet breath. I never did. Edward always told me he had everything under control. Karen nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something she was already beginning to suspect. It appears he did. She printed out a document and slid it across the desk toward me. I looked down, expecting to see the same modest figures I had already accepted. Instead, I saw numbers that did not belong to the life I thought I had been living. My eyes moved from one line to the next, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Certificates of deposit. A money market account. A trust. Each one bearing my name. Not jointly. Not shared. Mine. I do not understand, I said quietly. There must be some mistake. Karen shook her head gently. There is no mistake. These accounts have been active for years. Some of them for over a decade. She pulled another file from a drawer beside her desk and opened it, revealing pages of signed documents. My signature appeared again and again, neat and familiar, attached to forms I did not remember signing. Your husband likely had you sign these during routine updates, she explained. Address changes, account renewals, things like that. It is not uncommon. I stared at the papers, trying to recall those moments. The quick stops at the bank. Edward guiding me through where to sign, reassuring me it was nothing complicated. I had trusted him completely. And now, sitting there in that quiet office, I realized that trust had been met with something far more deliberate than I had ever imagined. There is more, Karen said, her voice lowering slightly. She turned back to her computer, opening another file. There is a trust account that has been receiving regular transfers for the past 5 years. The source appears to be a business account. My heart skipped, just once. Edward sold his business when he retired, I said. That is what Daniel told me. Karen's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. According to these records, the business account is still active. And it has been generating consistent revenue. The room felt very still. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just clear. Like a window had been opened somewhere inside me. How much? I asked. She hesitated, then turned the screen slightly so I could see. The number did not look real at first. It was too large, too distant from the life I had been living in that house with its familiar creaking floors and worn kitchen counters. But it was real. Every digit of it. I leaned back in my chair, letting the information settle. Outside, through the glass walls of the office, I could see people moving through their day, unaware that anything significant was happening. And yet, for me, everything had just shifted. Mrs. Hale, Karen said gently, did your husband ever express concerns about your family situation? I thought about Daniel. About the way he had avoided my eyes. About Sophie's quiet smile at the funeral. About the conversation I had overheard that morning in my own kitchen. Yes, I said after a moment. I believe he did. Karen nodded. Then it is possible he structured these accounts to ensure your independence. Everything here is legally yours. You have full control. Control. The word settled into place with a quiet certainty. Not power in the way people often imagine it, loud and visible, but something steadier. Something that did not need to be announced. I gathered the documents carefully, placing them back into my purse with deliberate precision. What would you recommend I do next? I asked. Karen met my eyes, her expression both professional and sincere. I would recommend speaking with an attorney who specializes in estate and trust management. And I would suggest you do so before discussing any of this with your family. I nodded. I agree. As I stood to leave, she added, Mrs. Hale, your husband made sure you would never be at anyone's mercy. I paused for a moment, my hand resting on the back of the chair. Yes, I said softly. He did. When I stepped back outside, the sunlight felt different, sharper somehow, as if the world had come into focus. I walked to my car slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to feel each step, to understand fully what had just been placed in my hands. The house I was returning to had not changed. Daniel and Sophie would still be there, still moving through it as if it already belonged to them. They would still be making plans, still speaking in careful tones about what was best for me. But now, I knew something they did not. I knew that the foundation beneath those plans was not what they believed it to be. And for the first time since Edward's funeral, I did not feel like I was being pushed out of my own life. I felt like I was stepping back into it, one quiet, deliberate decision at a time. When I pulled into the driveway, nothing looked different. The same white siding. The same rose bushes Edward had planted years ago. The same front door that had always meant safety, routine, belonging. But as I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, I realized something had changed. Not the house. Me. I stepped inside quietly, closing the door with a soft click that echoed more than it should have. Voices drifted from the living room, low but animated. I moved slowly down the hallway, not trying to hide, but not announcing myself either. Daniel was standing near the window, his phone in his hand, while Sophie sat on the couch with a notepad, her pen moving quickly. If we open up this wall, she was saying, gesturing toward the dining room, we could make the space feel bigger. And the kitchen definitely needs updating. New counters, new cabinets. It would add at least 50,000 to the value. Daniel nodded, distracted but agreeable. Yeah, we just need to get everything cleared out first. The sooner we list it, the better. I paused just out of sight, listening. There was no hesitation in their voices. No sense that this was still my home. No acknowledgement that I was even part of the conversation. It was as if I had already been removed, reduced to a detail to be managed. What about her? Daniel asked finally, his tone lower now. Sophie did not miss a beat. We will handle that. There are plenty of nice senior communities. Somewhere comfortable. Somewhere appropriate. Appropriate. The words settled heavily, but I did not react. Instead, I stepped forward, letting my presence interrupt the conversation naturally. I am back, I said calmly. Sophie looked up first, her expression shifting smoothly into something polite. Oh, Margaret. We did not hear you come in. Daniel glanced at me, then away again. Did you get everything you needed? I met his eyes for just a moment. Yes, I said simply. I did. I moved past them into the kitchen, setting my purse down with careful precision. My hands were steady. My breathing even. The documents inside that purse felt heavier than anything I had ever carried, not because of their weight, but because of what they represented. Knowledge. Authority. Time. Behind me, their conversation resumed, quieter now, more guarded. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the counter, listening without appearing to listen. We should call the realtor tomorrow, Sophie said softly. I already have someone in mind. Daniel hesitated. Do you think it is too soon? Daniel, she replied, her voice gentle but firm, we need to be practical. The market is good right now. And your mother, she will adjust. It is for the best. For the best. I took a sip of water, letting the phrase settle. It was interesting how often people used those words when making decisions that benefited themselves. Later that afternoon, Sophie began moving through the house with a new kind of purpose. Drawers opened and closed. Closets were inspected. I watched as she paused in the hallway, studying a framed photograph of Edward and me from years ago. She tilted her head slightly, as if evaluating its place in a design rather than its meaning in a life. Then she set it down on the console table, slightly off-center, as if it no longer mattered enough to place carefully. Daniel spent most of the time on his phone, stepping outside occasionally, his voice low and businesslike. I caught fragments of conversation. Yeah, it is a good property, needs some updates, we are planning to list soon. Each word confirmed what I already knew. They were not waiting for my agreement. They were moving forward as if it had already been given. As evening approached, I made dinner out of habit. Simple. Quiet. The kind of meal Edward used to appreciate after a long day. Daniel and Sophie joined me at the table, their conversation light, almost normal, as if nothing significant was happening beneath the surface. This is good, Mom, Daniel said, not quite meeting my eyes. Thank you, I replied. Sophie smiled politely. You have always been such a wonderful cook. I nodded, setting my fork down. I have had a lot of practice. There was a brief silence, the kind that comes when something unspoken hovers just beneath the surface. Daniel cleared his throat. We were thinking, he began, about the house. It is a lot to manage on your own. And with everything that has happened, he trailed off, as if searching for the right words. Sophie stepped in smoothly. We just want to make sure you are comfortable. Somewhere with support. Activities. People your own age. I looked at her, really looked this time. At the careful way she chose her words. At the confidence behind them. And the house? I asked quietly. Daniel shifted in his seat. It makes sense to sell it. It is too much space for one person. I let a small pause settle over the table before responding. I see, I said. And I did. More clearly than they could possibly imagine. That night, after they had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not empty. Not hollow. Just still. I reached into my purse and took out the documents, spreading them carefully across the coffee table. The numbers were the same as they had been at the bank. Real. Unchanged. Solid. Edward had not just left me memories. He had left me protection. Structure. Control. I traced my finger lightly over one of the pages, my name printed clearly at the top. For years, I had believed I was simply part of a life he managed. Now I understood that he had been building something beneath the surface, something that would only reveal itself when it was needed most. A quiet safeguard. A final act of care. Upstairs, I could hear faint movement, the sound of footsteps, a door closing. Life continuing, unaware that the ground beneath it had already shifted. I gathered the papers and returned them to my purse, closing it with a soft, deliberate click. I did not feel angry. Not in the way I might have expected. I felt focused. Clear. For the first time since the funeral, I was not reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing for what would happen next. And this time, I would not be the one being moved. The next morning, I woke up before the sun had fully risen, the pale light slipping quietly through the curtains and stretching across the bedroom floor. For a moment, I stayed still, listening to the silence, the kind that used to feel peaceful when Edward was still here. Now it felt different. Not empty. Just, observant. As if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I sat up slowly, smoothing my hand over the bedspread, my fingers pausing where Edward used to sleep. For years, I had woken up to the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet certainty that no matter what happened outside these walls, I was not alone inside them. That certainty had shaped everything about how I lived. How I trusted. How I allowed others to take the lead while I focused on keeping the home together. And now, sitting there in the early morning light, I realized how carefully he had been preparing for the day when that certainty would be gone. Not with grand gestures. Not with dramatic conversations. But with small, deliberate actions that I had barely noticed at the time. I remembered the way he would insist on stopping by the bank even when it seemed unnecessary. The way he would slide documents across the table for me to sign, his voice calm, reassuring, telling me it was just routine. I had never questioned him. Why would I? He had never given me a reason to. But now those memories felt different. Sharper. Each one a piece of something larger that I was only just beginning to understand. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly. The street outside looked exactly as it always had. Quiet. Familiar. Unchanged. But I knew better now. Change does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it moves quietly, settling into place before anyone realizes what has shifted. Downstairs, I could hear movement. Cabinet doors opening. The soft clink of dishes. Sophie was already awake. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple blouse and slacks, taking a moment longer than usual to arrange my hair. Not out of vanity, but out of intention. Every movement felt more deliberate now, as if I were stepping into a role I had not known I was meant to play. When I entered the kitchen, Sophie was standing at the counter, scrolling through something on her phone while a cup of coffee sat untouched beside her. She looked up briefly. "Good morning," she said, her tone light but distracted. "Morning," I replied, moving to pour myself a cup. Daniel came in a few minutes later, his expression already preoccupied, his attention divided between his phone and whatever plans were forming in his mind. "I have a call in an hour," he said, mostly to Sophie. "About the listing?" She nodded. "I have already started putting together some ideas. We should make a few updates before we show it. Nothing major. Just enough to increase the value." Increase the value. I stirred my coffee slowly, the spoon moving in small, steady circles. "And how long do you think all of that will take?" I asked, my voice calm. Sophie glanced at Daniel before answering. "Not long. A couple of weeks, maybe." A couple of weeks. The same timeline they had already begun to construct around my life. Daniel finally looked at me. "We will make sure you are settled somewhere before that," he said. "Somewhere comfortable." I met his gaze, holding it just long enough for him to feel it. "I am sure you will try," I said quietly. He frowned slightly, as if he was not entirely sure how to interpret that, then looked away. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. Not visibly. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to see the edges of it. After breakfast, Daniel left for his call, stepping outside with his phone pressed to his ear. Sophie gathered a stack of papers and moved into the dining room, spreading them out across the table. Floor plans. Notes. Lists. I watched her for a moment before turning away and heading toward the hallway closet. Inside, tucked neatly on the top shelf, was a small box Edward had kept for years. I had seen it countless times, but I had never opened it. It had always been his. His space. His responsibility. But now, standing there with the morning light filtering in behind me, I reached up and took it down. It was lighter than I expected. When I opened it, I found a collection of documents, carefully organized, each one labeled in Edward's precise handwriting. Old insurance papers. Property records. Business statements. And at the bottom, a folder that immediately caught my attention. It was labeled simply, Margaret. My name, written in his steady, familiar script. I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it slowly. Inside were copies of the same documents I had seen at the bank, along with additional notes, explanations written in Edward's hand. He had outlined everything. The accounts. The trust. The structure of the assets. But more than that, he had left something else. A letter. I held it for a moment before unfolding it, my fingers tracing the crease where it had been carefully folded and refolded over time. The paper felt fragile, but the words were anything but. "If you are reading this," it began, "then I am no longer there to explain things in person. I am sorry for that. But I need you to understand something. You are stronger than you think, and you are more capable than anyone has ever given you credit for. Including me, at times." I paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "I have seen the way Daniel has changed. The way he listens less and assumes more. And I have seen the influence Sophie has over him. I do not say this to upset you, but to prepare you. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are in control. I wanted to make sure that when that moment came, you would not be at their mercy." My hands tightened slightly on the paper. Not in fear. In recognition. Everything I have put in place is meant to give you options. Not to force you into any particular choice, but to ensure that whatever you decide, it is truly yours. Do not let anyone rush you. Do not let anyone convince you that you are less than you are. And most importantly, do not mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes, it is the most powerful position you can hold. I lowered the letter slowly, my gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, I could see Sophie moving through the yard, speaking on her phone, her gestures animated, confident. Inside the house, everything looked the same as it always had. But nothing was the same anymore. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder, along with the other documents. For years, I had believed that Edward had been the one holding everything together. And in many ways, he had been. But now, I understood that he had also been preparing me to do the same. Just in a different way. A quieter way. A way that did not rely on being seen or acknowledged. Downstairs, I could hear Sophie's voice again, clear and certain. Yes, we are ready to move forward, she was saying. As soon as possible. I closed the box and set it aside, my movements calm, deliberate. Ready. The word echoed faintly in my mind. They thought they were ready. They thought they understood the situation. They thought they were already in control. I stood up, smoothing my blouse, my reflection catching briefly in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the same one who had sat at that funeral, listening to her son call her a burden. She was still quiet. Still composed. But there was something else there now. Something they had not seen. And something they would not understand until it was far too late. By midday, the house no longer felt like mine. Not because anything had physically changed, but because of how confidently Daniel and Sophie moved through it. As if decisions had already been made and I was simply catching up to them. I watched from the hallway as Sophie stood with a man in a navy blazer, someone I had never seen before, walking him through the living room with a quiet authority that did not belong to her. "The natural light is great in here," she said, gesturing toward the windows. "And once we open up the space, it will feel even bigger." The man nodded, taking notes, his eyes scanning the walls, the floors, the details that had once meant something to me. Daniel stood nearby, arms crossed, listening carefully, asking questions about timelines, about pricing, about what needed to be done first. No one had asked me if I was comfortable with any of this. No one had paused to consider that I was still living here. I stepped forward slowly, my presence finally registering. "And who is this?" I asked calmly. Sophie turned, her expression shifting instantly into something polite, almost rehearsed. "Margaret, this is Jason. He is a realtor I have worked with before. We are just exploring options." Exploring. The word felt almost gentle, if it had not been so clearly untrue. Jason extended his hand. "It is nice to meet you, Mrs. Hale." I shook it briefly, my grip steady. "I see," I said, my voice even. "And what exactly are you exploring?" Daniel stepped in quickly, his tone measured, as if he were trying to keep the situation from becoming uncomfortable. "We are just looking at what it would take to get the house ready, Mom. Nothing is decided yet." I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for the silence to settle between us. "It seems like quite a bit has already been decided," I replied. Sophie's smile tightened slightly, just enough for me to notice. "We are only trying to help," she said. "This is a big house. It makes sense to start planning." Planning. Always that word. I nodded once, as if accepting it, even though I knew better. "Of course," I said quietly. "Planning is important." I turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving them to their measurements and their conversations. I did not need to hear the rest. I already understood the direction they were heading. What mattered now was not what they were doing, but what I was going to do. Next. Later that afternoon, Daniel approached me while I was sitting in the living room, the folder from Edward still fresh in my mind, though safely tucked away out of sight. He stood for a moment before speaking, as if rehearsing the words in his head. "Mom, we need to talk about a timeline," he said finally. I looked up at him, my expression calm. "What kind of timeline?" He shifted slightly, his hands moving into his pockets. "For the house. And, for you. We think it would be best if you started looking at other options soon. Maybe within the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The same number Sophie had mentioned earlier. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a plan. I let a small pause stretch between us before responding. "That is a very specific timeline," I said. Daniel nodded, a little too quickly. "It just makes things easier. For everyone. For everyone." I studied his face, noticing the subtle tension around his eyes, the way he avoided holding my gaze for too long. "And what happens if I am not ready in 2 weeks?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a second. We will help you figure it out, he said. The answer was vague, but the intention behind it was not. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I appreciate your concern, I said. But I will make my own decisions about where and when I move. Sophie's voice came from the doorway before Daniel could respond. Margaret, we are only trying to make this transition easier for you. I turned my head to look at her. Transitions are rarely easy, I said softly. But they should at least be honest. For a moment, the room was quiet. Not tense. Just still. As if something had been acknowledged without being fully spoken. Daniel cleared his throat. We just want what is best, he said again, repeating the phrase as if it would carry more weight the second time. I nodded once. I understand. And I did. More than he realized. That evening, they continued their discussions, more openly now, as if my quiet responses had been interpreted as agreement. I listened from a distance, noting the details, the sequence of their plans, the assumptions they were building everything on. They believed time was on their side. They believed I would follow the path they were laying out for me. They believed I had no real options. That belief was their greatest mistake. After dinner, I returned to my room and closed the door gently behind me. The house settled into its usual nighttime quiet, but beneath that quiet, there was movement. Not physical movement. Something else. A shift in direction. I sat at the desk near the window and took out the documents again, along with Edward's letter. I read it once more, slower this time, letting each word settle fully. Do not let anyone rush you. Do not let anyone convince you that you are less than you are. And most importantly, do not mistake silence for weakness. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. Then I reached for my phone. There was a number Karen had given me earlier that day, written neatly on the back of her business card. An attorney. Someone who specialized in exactly the kind of situation I was now in. I held the card for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. Not because it was difficult, but because it marked a clear step forward. A line crossed quietly, without announcement. I dialed the number and waited as it rang. When a calm, professional voice answered, I spoke clearly. Hello, my name is Margaret Hale. I was referred to you regarding some estate and trust matters. I would like to schedule a consultation as soon as possible. There was a brief pause, then a response. Of course, Mrs. Hale. We can see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Tomorrow morning. I glanced toward the window, where the last light of the day had faded into darkness. That works, I said. Thank you. I ended the call and set the phone down gently on the desk. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, the house was still. But beneath that stillness, everything was beginning to move in a direction they could not yet see. They thought they were setting the timeline. They thought they were deciding what happened next. But as I turned off the lamp and prepared for the night, I knew the truth. The timeline had already changed. And they were no longer the ones in control of it. I arrived at the attorney's office 10 minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to walk in without feeling rushed. The building was quiet, a clean glass structure with soft lighting and a reception desk that felt more like a hotel than a law firm. I gave my name, and within minutes, I was escorted into a private office where a man in his late 50s stood up to greet me. Mrs. Hale, he said, offering a firm but respectful handshake. I am Robert Whitaker. Please, have a seat. His voice carried a calm authority, the kind that did not need to be proven. I sat across from him, placing my purse carefully on the chair beside me before taking out the folder Edward had left behind. For a moment, I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of everything it represented. Then I slid it across the desk. I believe my husband prepared this for me, I said. I would like to understand exactly what it means. Robert opened the folder slowly, his eyes scanning the first few pages with practiced precision. The room remained quiet except for the soft sound of paper turning. His expression did not change much, but I noticed the slight shift in his posture, the way he leaned in just a little more as he continued reading. After a few minutes, he looked up at me, his gaze steady. "Your husband was very thorough," he said. "And very intentional." I nodded once. "That seems to be a pattern I am only just beginning to notice." He allowed himself a small, knowing smile before continuing. "What you have here is not just a collection of accounts. It is a structured financial strategy designed to protect you. The trust, in particular, is significant." He turned one of the documents toward me, pointing to a section near the bottom. "You are listed as the sole controlling beneficiary. That means you have full authority over the assets within it. No one else can access or make decisions regarding these funds without your explicit consent." I let that settle in for a moment. "And my son?" I asked. Robert shook his head slightly. "Your son has no direct control here. In fact, based on these documents, any attempt to access or influence these assets without your approval would be legally blocked." There was no emotion in his voice when he said it. Just clarity. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. "So everything they have been planning," I said quietly, "is based on an assumption that is not true." "That would be correct," Robert replied. He closed the folder gently, folding his hands on top of it. "May I ask what prompted you to come in today?" I met his gaze without hesitation. "My husband's funeral was yesterday," I said. "And within hours, my son and his wife began making plans to sell my home and move me into a facility." Robert's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes. "I see," he said. "And have you agreed to any of these plans?" "No," I answered. "But they seem to believe that I will." He nodded slowly. "That is often how situations like this unfold. People act quickly when they believe there is no resistance." I thought about Daniel's voice, about Sophie's quiet confidence, about the way they had already begun measuring rooms as if I were no longer part of the equation. "They believe I have no leverage," I said. Robert leaned back slightly, considering. "Then the question becomes," he said, "how and when you choose to show them that you do." The room fell quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not uncertain. Focused. "What would you recommend?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a legal pad and began writing a few notes, his movements steady and deliberate. "First," he said, "we ensure that all your assets are fully secured. That means confirming access points, updating any necessary permissions, and making sure that no one else can interfere with your accounts." He looked up briefly. "Second, we establish a clear legal boundary regarding your property. The house is in your name, correct?" "Yes," I said. "It always has been." "Good," he replied. "That simplifies things. No one can sell or make changes to that property without your authorization. Not even your son." I felt a quiet sense of confirmation settle into place. Everything Edward had prepared was working exactly as intended. "And third," Robert continued, "we decide how you want to handle the situation moving forward. You have options. You can confront them directly. You can set boundaries quietly. Or you can allow them to continue under their current assumptions while you prepare your response." I considered that last option carefully. It aligned with something Edward had written. "Do not let anyone rush you. Do not mistake silence for weakness." "I think I would prefer the third option," I said. Robert nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Then we will proceed accordingly." He turned the folder back toward me, tapping it lightly. "You have something most people in your situation do not. Time. Information. Control. The key is to use them wisely." I reached for the folder, my fingers closing around it with a quiet certainty. "I intend to," I said. As I stood to leave, Robert added one more thing. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice steady, "people often reveal their true intentions when they believe they are already winning. If you allow them to continue, you may learn more than if you stop them too soon." I paused for a moment, considering his words. Then I gave a small nod. I believe I already have, I said. Outside, the morning air felt crisp, the sunlight sharper than it had been the day before. I walked to my car without hesitation, the folder held securely in my hand. When I got inside, I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I sat there for a moment, letting everything settle into place. They thought I was alone. They thought I was unprepared. They thought I would follow the path they had already mapped out for me. But now, I knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, I knew exactly where they did not. When I finally pulled out of the parking lot, there was no rush in my movements, no urgency in my decisions. Everything was measured. Intentional. Quiet. The same way Edward had prepared all of this. The same way I would carry it forward. By the time I returned home, Daniel's car was already in the driveway, and Sophie's voice drifted faintly from inside the house. Their plans were still moving forward, unchanged, uninterrupted. And for now, I would let them continue. Because the more certain they became, the less prepared they would be for what was coming next. When I walked back into the house, nothing had changed on the surface, but I could feel the difference immediately. Not in the walls or the furniture, but in the rhythm of things. The way Daniel spoke more confidently, the way Sophie moved with a kind of quiet ownership that no longer bothered to hide itself. They believed they were moving forward. They believed the outcome was already decided. And that belief made them careless. I set my purse down in the same place as always, my movements unhurried, as if I had nowhere else to be and nothing else on my mind. Sophie was in the dining room again, papers spread out, her pen moving quickly as she made notes. Daniel stood nearby, scrolling through something on his phone. Jason says we could list it by next week if we start now, he said. Sophie nodded. That is perfect. We just need to finalize the updates and get everything staged. I stepped into the room, my presence acknowledged but not truly considered. That seems fast, I said. Daniel glanced up briefly. The market is strong right now. It makes sense to move quickly. I gave a small nod. Of course it does. Sophie looked at me, her expression softening just enough to appear considerate. We are making this as easy as possible for you, Margaret. We will handle everything. Everything. The word echoed faintly, but I did not challenge it. Not yet. Instead, I moved past them, taking a seat at the table as if I were simply part of the conversation, not the subject of it. And where exactly do you plan for me to go? I asked calmly. Daniel shifted slightly, his tone careful. We have been looking at a few places. There is a community about 15 miles from here. It is nice. Clean. They have activities, medical staff, everything you might need. Everything I might need. I folded my hands neatly in front of me. Have you already spoken to them? Sophie answered this time. We made a few calls this morning. Just to get information. I nodded slowly, as if processing it. You have been very busy. There was a brief pause, the kind that settles when something is said without being fully explained. Daniel cleared his throat. We are just trying to stay ahead of things, he said. There is a lot to manage. I met his eyes for a moment, long enough for him to feel it, but not long enough to create confrontation. Yes, I said quietly. There is. The conversation moved on, but I could feel the shift. Not in them. In me. I was no longer reacting to what they were saying. I was observing how they said it, how quickly they moved from one decision to the next, how little space they left for anything that did not fit their plan. Later that afternoon, I noticed something else. Sophie had started making lists. Not just for the house, but for me. I saw one of them lying on the kitchen counter, partially covered by a stack of mail. I did not reach for it immediately. I waited until she stepped out of the room, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but focused. Then I walked over and looked down at the paper. It was written in neat, organized handwriting. Margaret, Essentials. Beneath it, a list of items. Clothes. Medications. Personal documents. Jewelry. Each one carefully noted, as if I were already being packed. I did not feel anger. Not in the way I might have before. What I felt was clarity. They were not planning with me. They were planning around me. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. I set the paper back exactly where I had found it and stepped away, my movements slow and deliberate. Across the room, Sophie's voice drifted back in. Yes, we are ready to move forward, she was saying again. The sooner the better. I moved into the living room and sat down, my gaze resting briefly on Edward's photograph. His expression, captured in that single moment, seemed almost knowing now. As if he had anticipated this exact sequence of events. As if he had understood something I had not yet been ready to see. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are in control. His words echoed faintly in my mind, not from memory, but from the letter I had read just hours before. And now, sitting there in the quiet of the room, I could see exactly what he meant. Daniel and Sophie were not hiding anything anymore. They were not being careful with their words or their actions. They were moving openly, confidently, as if there were no reason to hold back. And that openness was giving me everything I needed. That evening, Daniel approached me again, his tone more direct this time. We need to finalize things soon, Mom, he said. The realtor wants to come back tomorrow to take photos. I looked up at him, my expression calm. Photos of what? I asked. He hesitated, just slightly. The house, he said. To get it ready for listing. I let a small pause settle between us. And you have already agreed to this? He shifted, his confidence flickering for just a moment. We are in the process, he said. Sophie stepped in from behind him, her voice smooth. It is just preparation. Nothing is official yet. I nodded once. I see. There was a moment where they both seemed to be waiting for something. A reaction. A refusal. Resistance. But I gave them none of it. Instead, I simply said, you should do what you think is best. The words landed softly, but I could see the effect immediately. Relief. Subtle, but unmistakable. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly. Sophie's expression brightened, just a fraction. They had interpreted my silence exactly as they wanted to. Agreement. Compliance. Permission. And that was exactly what I needed them to believe. That night, as the house settled into silence once again, I sat at the table with the folder open in front of me, Edward's letter resting beside it. The numbers had not changed. The structure had not shifted. Everything was still exactly as it had been that morning. Solid. Untouched. Mine. I traced my finger lightly over the edge of one of the documents, my thoughts steady, focused. They were moving quickly now. Faster than before. And the faster they moved, the more certain they became. The more certain they became, the less they questioned anything that did not fit their expectations. And that was where their plan would begin to fail. I closed the folder carefully and returned it to my purse, the soft click of the clasp echoing faintly in the quiet room. Tomorrow, they would take photos. Tomorrow, they would move one step closer to a future they believed they controlled. And tomorrow, I would let them. Because sometimes, the most powerful move is not to stop what is happening, but to let it unfold exactly as planned. Right up until the moment it no longer can. The next morning arrived with a quiet kind of certainty, the kind that does not rush or announce itself, but simply settles into place as if it had always been there. I woke before anyone else, the house still wrapped in that fragile stillness that exists just before the day begins. For a moment, I lay there, listening. Not for sounds, but for patterns. The subtle rhythm of a house that had not yet been disturbed. And then I got up. I dressed the same way I had the day before. Calm. Deliberate. Not for them, but for myself. When I stepped into the kitchen, the light had already begun to fill the room, soft and even. I made my coffee slowly, the familiar motions grounding me in something steady, something unchanged. By the time Daniel came downstairs, his phone already in his hand, I was seated at the table, waiting without appearing to wait. "The realtor will be here at 10, he said, not looking up. "We should keep things simple. Just let him take what he needs." I nodded once. "Of course," I said. Sophie followed shortly after, moving with that same quiet efficiency she had adopted over the past few days. "I already cleared most of the surfaces," she added. "It will photograph better this way." I glanced around the kitchen. The counters were bare. The small details that had once made the space feel lived in had been removed. It looked cleaner. Larger. Less personal. Exactly the way someone would want it to look before selling it. "It does look different," I said. Sophie smiled lightly. "That is the idea." I did not respond. There was no need to. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Daniel answered it immediately, greeting Jason with an easy familiarity, as if this were already a done deal rather than a step in a process that had never been approved. Jason walked in with a camera slung over his shoulder, his eyes already scanning the space. "We will start with the main living areas," he said. "Natural light is best this time of day." Sophie moved ahead of him, guiding him through the house, pointing out angles, suggesting improvements, speaking as if she had been part of this process for years. Daniel followed, adding details where he could, reinforcing the impression that everything was already in motion. I stayed where I was for a moment, finishing my coffee, letting them move ahead without me. Then, quietly, I stood and followed at a distance. The camera clicked softly as Jason moved from room to room, capturing images that would soon be used to present this house to strangers. Each click felt like a small confirmation of something they believed to be inevitable. In the living room, Sophie adjusted a pillow before stepping back. "Does that work?" she asked. Jason nodded. "Perfect." Daniel glanced at me briefly, then back at the scene. "We should have everything ready by next week," he said. "Maybe even sooner." I walked into the room fully then, my presence no longer at the edge of things, but directly within them. "You are moving very quickly," I said. Jason paused, lowering his camera slightly, his attention shifting to me. "We try to take advantage of good timing," he said politely. I met his gaze, my expression calm. "Timing is important," I replied. "But so is permission." The words settled into the room with a quiet weight. Not loud. Not confrontational. Just present. Daniel's posture shifted almost immediately. "Mom," he said, his tone tightening slightly, "we talked about this." I turned my head just enough to look at him. "We discussed your plans," I said. "That is not the same thing." Sophie stepped in, her voice smooth, controlled. "Margaret, nothing is final yet. This is just preparation." I nodded slowly. "Preparation for what?" I asked. There was a brief pause, the kind that comes when a question does not have an easy answer. Jason glanced between us, sensing the shift, his professional demeanor holding, but his movements slowing. Daniel exhaled, his patience thinning. "For selling the house," he said. "For moving forward." I let a small silence follow his words before responding. "And who exactly made that decision?" I asked. The room grew still. Not dramatically. Just enough for the absence of movement to be felt. Sophie's expression remained composed, but I could see the calculation behind it, the quick reassessment of how this moment was unfolding. "We all agreed it was the best option," she said carefully. I looked at her, holding her gaze just long enough to let the truth sit between us. "No," I said quietly. "You decided it was the best option for you." Daniel's voice sharpened slightly. "That is not fair." I turned back to him, my tone unchanged. "What is not fair is assuming control over something that is not yours to control." The words were simple. Direct. And for the first time since the funeral, they did not land as something they could easily dismiss. Jason shifted his weight, lowering his camera fully now. "Perhaps I should give you a moment," he said, already stepping back. "No," I said gently, stopping him. "Please. Stay." I reached into my purse, my movements slow, deliberate, drawing their attention without urgency. The folder was exactly where I had left it. I placed it on the table and opened it carefully, the sound of paper moving in the quiet room sharper than anything that had been said so far. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "What is that?" he asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I turned one of the documents toward him, letting him see it clearly for the first time. His expression changed as he read, the confidence that had carried him through the past few days faltering just enough to be visible. "What is this?" he asked again, his voice lower now. "It is ownership," I said. "It is authority. It is everything you assumed I did not have." Sophie stepped closer, her composure tightening, her eyes moving quickly over the page. "That does not make sense," she said. "We were told," she stopped herself, but it was too late. I looked at her steadily. "You were told what you wanted to hear," I said. "Without ever asking me." The silence that followed was different now. Heavier. Not because of what had been said, but because of what could no longer be ignored. Daniel looked up at me, confusion and something else beginning to replace the certainty he had been holding on to. "So, what does this mean?" he asked. I closed the folder slowly, my hand resting lightly on top of it. "It means," I said calmly, "that nothing in this house moves forward without me." I let that settle for a moment before continuing. "Not the listing. Not the sale. Not the decisions about where I go or how I live." Sophie's voice was tighter now, controlled but strained. "Margaret, we were only trying to help." I met her gaze, my expression steady. "Help does not take control," I said. "It offers support. There is a difference." No one spoke after that. The room held its silence, not empty, but full. Full of everything that had been misunderstood, assumed, and now finally seen clearly. And as I stood there, calm and composed, I realized something simple and undeniable. They had been moving forward with a plan that never belonged to them. And now, for the first time, they understood that it never would. For a long moment, no one moved. Jason stood near the doorway, his camera lowered, unsure whether he was still part of the situation or had become an accidental witness to something far more personal. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the folder in front of me, as if looking at it long enough might change what it meant. Sophie, on the other hand, recovered first. She always did. I watched the way her posture straightened, the way her expression softened again, carefully rebuilding the composure that had slipped just seconds earlier. "Margaret," she said gently, her tone measured, "this does not have to become a conflict. We are family." I let her words settle before responding, not because I needed time to think, but because silence had become far more effective than immediate answers. "Family does not make decisions in someone else's place," I said quietly. Daniel finally stepped forward, his voice no longer as steady as it had been. "Why did you not tell us about any of this?" he asked. I looked at him, really looked this time, seeing not just the man standing in front of me, but the assumptions he had been carrying. "You did not ask," I replied. The simplicity of the answer seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, as if realizing there was nothing to argue with. Sophie's eyes shifted, calculating again, adjusting. "We were trying to make things easier for you," she said. "After everything that happened, we thought it would be best if we took care of things." I nodded once. "You thought it would be best if you took control," I said. Her expression tightened, just for a moment. "That is not what this is," she replied. "Then what is it?" I asked calmly. Another pause. This one longer. More revealing. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration beginning to surface. "This is not about control," he said. "This is about being practical." You cannot manage all of this on your own. I held his gaze steadily. I have managed it for years, I said. I simply allowed you to believe that I had not. The room grew quiet again, but this time it was different. Not uncertain. Not tense. Just clear. Jason shifted slightly. Near the door. I can come back another time, he offered carefully. No, I said again, my voice calm but firm. There will not be another time. I turned to him, offering a small, polite nod. Thank you for your time today, but I will not be listing the house. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded in understanding. Of course, Mrs. Hale. He gathered his camera, moving toward the door with quiet efficiency, leaving the three of us standing in the space that had just shifted in a way none of them had expected. The sound of the front door closing behind him echoed faintly through the house. Daniel turned back to me immediately. You cannot just make that decision without talking to us, he said. I raised my eyebrows slightly. I just did, I replied. His frustration sharpened. Mom, this affects all of us. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. It affects me. This is my home. My decision. Sophie stepped forward, her voice more controlled now, but edged with something less patient. We have already invested time into this, she said. We have made calls, arranged things, started the process. I looked at her evenly. Then perhaps you should have confirmed that the process was yours to start, I said. She held my gaze, her composure holding, but the certainty behind it beginning to fracture. Daniel exhaled sharply, pacing once across the room before turning back. So what now? He asked. You just stay here? Alone? There was something in his tone now that was not just frustration, but disbelief. As if the possibility had never truly occurred to him. Yes, I said simply. I stay here. He shook his head slightly. That does not make sense, he said. It makes perfect sense, I replied. It is the first decision in this entire situation that actually belongs to me. Sophie crossed her arms, her voice quieter now, but more direct. And what about everything else? She asked. The accounts. The assets. You expect to manage all of that on your own? I let a small pause settle before answering. I already am, I said. The words landed without force, but their impact was immediate. Daniel's expression shifted again, confusion giving way to something else. Something closer to realization. You knew, he said slowly. You knew about all of this before today. I held his gaze. I knew enough, I said. And I made sure I understood the rest before I said anything. Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly. So you let this happen, she said. You let us go through all of this without saying a word. I nodded once. Yes, I said. I did. Daniel looked at me, searching for something he could hold on to. Why? He asked. The question was simple. Honest, in a way he had not been before. I considered it for a moment before answering. Because people show you who they are when they believe there are no consequences, I said quietly. And I needed to see that clearly. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was final. Not in the sense that everything was over, but in the sense that something had been fully understood, with no room left for misinterpretation. Sophie looked away first, her expression unreadable now, her thoughts moving too quickly to settle on anything visible. Daniel remained where he was, his shoulders slightly lowered, the certainty he had carried into this moment no longer there to support him. I closed the folder gently, the sound soft but definitive, and picked it up from the table. This house is not for sale, I said calmly. And my life is not a decision for anyone else to manage. I turned then, walking toward the hallway with the same steady pace I had maintained from the beginning. No rush. No hesitation. Just movement. Behind me, neither of them spoke. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. Not because they had nothing to say, but because, for the first time, they understood that saying it would not change anything. Upstairs, I paused for a moment outside the bedroom, my hand resting lightly against the doorframe. The house felt different again. Not because anything had been taken from it, but because something had been returned. Control. Not loud. Not visible. But present in every quiet decision that followed. And as I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, I realized something simple, something that had been there all along, waiting to be understood. They had tried to move me out of my own life. But all they had really done was remind me that it was mine to live.